Hello, everybody. I'm not quite sure if it's morning, afternoon, or evening for you, but it's morning here in England, and it's a real pleasure to be invited by the sacred island of Okinoshima and the associated sites of the Munakata Region World Heritage Committee to talk to you today about my interest in setting Okinoshima in a global context. My theme today is Okinoshima in world perspective, weaving narratives of ritual, politics, and exchange. First of all, let's meet the three goddesses of the Munakata region, the reason perhaps that we're all here, and one of the main reasons why Okinoshima was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site back in 2017. They are, of course, Tagutsuhime no Kami, Tagorihime no Kami, and Ichishiki Mahime no Kami. And in the course of my talk, I'm going to introduce you and them to some of their global sisters in goddess studies from around the world. To start off with today, I would like to consider a little of the context of the World Heritage Movement. And in particular, I want to think about the relationship between World Heritage and sacred sites. Now, the World Heritage Convention, or the Convention Concerning the Protection of World Cultural and Natural Heritage, was passed by UNESCO in 1972. And it grew out of ideas for the international protection of heritage following the First World War. But it wasn't until after the Second World War, with the establishment of the United Nations and following that, the establishment of UNESCO, that these ideas really gained traction. There are many World Heritage Sites in the world today, and we'll take a closer look at that in just a second. But as I said, today's talk is very much about religious sites or sacred sites. And these are right at the heart of UNESCO's World Heritage Mission at the moment. In many countries of the world, including my own, the United Kingdom, and Japan, archaeology is recognized as a fragile and finite resource. Archaeology can help us understand what it means to be human, how we came to be what we are today. But there are many debates and discussions around archaeology and heritage, in particular perhaps sacred sites, because they generate many different viewpoints. And recent scholars have accepted that many sites of sacred heritage in particular are contested. There are different views about their significance, about their meaning, about their importance, and about the merits of preserving or not. Here is a particularly extreme example of what happens when two worldviews clash in this arena of contested heritage. In the summer of 2015, the Temple of Baal Shamin at the UNESCO World Heritage Site at Palmyra, one of the best preserved cities from the ancient world, was destroyed deliberately by members of ISIS, the Islamic Caliphate. This event caused outrage across large parts of the world. But for the supporters of ISIS, the destruction of this monument was a very important political as well as a religious act. And if we don't understand why that was, it's difficult for us to really understand why that happened. I'm afraid this is not a completely up-to-date map. It's from 2016, and it was produced by the UNESCO World Heritage Centre. It's a rather strange shaped map of the world, and it's designed to show the disproportionate distribution of World Heritage Sites across the globe. As you can see, Europe has a very large proportion of World Heritage Sites, whereas the other continents have many less. Now, the World Heritage Convention was ratified by different countries at different times. The United Kingdom ratified it in 1984, and we now have 32 World Heritage Sites in our country. Japan only ratified the convention in 1992, and there are now 24 World Heritage Sites. Across the world, there are over 1,100 World Heritage Sites, and these sites are divided into sites of cultural significance, sites of natural significance, some sites which are both, and as you can see, the majority are cultural. I'm sorry, the bottom line isn't quite correct on there, and the natural ones are about a fifth of the total represented. I've been very interested in recent years following the World Heritage movement in Japan. And I think it's fair to say that Japan is perhaps one of the most enthusiastic proponents of the World Heritage movement anywhere in the world. Many of Japan's most iconic buildings and places are World Heritage Sites, including Mount Fuji, which very interestingly was inscribed for cultural rather than for natural reasons. Perhaps for many people outside Japan, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, the Genbaku Dome, is one of the most famous, instantly globally recognizable symbols of World Heritage. But there are many others, including castles such as Himeji Castle, and a large number of religious sites, including the temples and shrines of Nara, Kyoto, Nikko, and many other parts of Japan. Now, the vast majority of these sites are popular tourist destinations, and they can easily be visited both by Japanese tourists and by overseas tourists. One of the things that I find particularly interesting about the sacred island of Okinoshima is that ordinary visitors are not allowed to go there. And I think that this presents some very particular issues and problems, both in the presentation and in the appreciation of the significance of this particular World Heritage Site. Now, I am an archaeologist by training, and I'm very aware that most archaeological excavations, the main activity, if you like, that archaeologists undertake as part of their professional practice, most excavations happen for a relatively limited amount of time. And we describe archaeological excavations as unrepeatable experiments. We can only excavate a site once. It's difficult to go back and excavate the same thing over and over and over again. But what we can do is we can go back and we can re-excavate, if you like, or reanalyze and reinterpret materials that were excavated in the course of original investigations. And one of the things about the World Heritage Movement, especially in recent years, that I think has been a tremendously positive development, has been the way in which the nomination of World Heritage Sites has stimulated an enormous amount of new research on sites which are perhaps very well known, or we think are very well known. And this reanalysis, using the latest techniques which are available to archaeologists, to historians, to curators, allows us to completely re-understand in new ways some of the discoveries that were made a long time ago. This is perhaps particularly the case at Okinoshima and the associated sites of the Munakata region. Excavations took place on Okinoshima many decades ago and produced some wonderful, well-illustrated, beautifully produced archaeological reports. But as part of the nomination process for the World Heritage status, the committee in charge of the World Heritage nomination at Okinoshima commissioned international specialists from Japan and overseas to reconsider what we know about Okinoshima and to set it in a global context. And I was very privileged to be invited to undertake some of that research myself, in particular setting Okinoshima in a global perspective, my theme for today. And I found it tremendously interesting reading through all of the reports that were produced, and here's some of them which are now available on the Okinoshima World Heritage website. And I would encourage all of you to dip into this treasury of information about the sacred island and the associated sites. As I said, I was invited to talk about, or to do some research on the comparative analysis of Okinoshima. Now, the purpose of the comparative analysis as part of the World Heritage nomination process is really to inform the ways in which something which we call outstanding universal value is assigned to these sites. And the outstanding universal value is the measure by which proposed sites are inscribed or not as UNESCO World Heritage. In brief, this process really involves looking at the existing list of World Heritage sites to see, are there any which are very similar to the site that is being proposed. Now, Okinoshima fitted many of the categories, and I spent some time looking into a number of types of sacred site, which I thought could be compared to Okinoshima. And these included sacred islands, sacred mountains, sacred groves, centers of pilgrimage, natural places which were the foci of worship, burial grounds, and lastly, trade routes. And I was very interested in the relationship between religion and trade routes and the ways in which religious ideas spread along those trade routes. And I will talk about that a little bit later in my talk. I was able to pull together some of my thoughts in a short book, which I put together with help from the members of the World Heritage Committee and some of my colleagues outside Okinoshima, the universal value of Japan's sacred heritage. And it tells the story a little bit of the World Heritage nomination and why I thought it was so significant. Now, for many years, archaeologists were very skeptical about being able to say very much about the development of religion. Many archaeologists felt more comfortable talking about the technology behind the pottery sherds that they excavated, or the economy behind the animal bones and the other remains that they found that they thought could tell about economy and subsistence. But in recent years, a number of archaeologists have published very interesting works on the archaeology of religion. And as I said in one of my earlier papers for the World Heritage Nomination Project, I felt that there's been something of a revolution in archaeology in the last 10 years or so, perhaps the same period of time that the Okinoshima World Heritage Nomination was happening, which means that archaeologists feel much more confident in engaging with religion as an area of study. For many years, if we discovered artifacts that we could not understand their purpose of immediately, an example that I'm very familiar with are the Dogu clay figurines from the Jomon period, we would say, they must be ritual, very mysterious. We don't really understand what it was all about. But books like the Oxford Handbook of Archaeology or Sharon Stedman's Archaeology of Religion have started to give us a real methodology within archaeology for understanding these ritual remains and sacred sites much better. And in Japan, there is a wonderful tradition, a long-standing tradition of ritual archaeology, or the archaeology of religion, perhaps stretching back to Professor Oba Iwao at Kokugakuin University in Tokyo, who produced a wonderful series of books called Shinto Kokugaku no Koza, or a series of studies on Shinto archaeology. And it's possible to draw on much of the work there to think about some of the materials that we find at sites such as Okinoshima. There are two books in particular I want to introduce to you today, and they're two brand new books. And in preparing for this lecture, I've taken some time out and I've greatly enjoyed reading both of these. And I would recommend them to any of you who have an interest in the archaeology of sacred sites. One is Sacred Heritage, Monastic Archaeology, Identities and Beliefs by Roberta Gilchrist, who is a medieval archaeologist at the University of Reading in England. And Professor Gilchrist has specialized in the study of medieval monasteries, and in particular, actually, medieval nunneries, and is very interested in questions of gender and how archaeologists can help us understand the social organization of some of these remarkable sites. And the second book is called Sacred Heritage in Japan, and it's edited by Eike Rotz, and one of the great specialists of Shinto studies in Europe today, Mark Chewan. And this book sets out a series of really interesting case studies in the ways in which sacred heritage is dealt with today in Japan, including mentions of Okinoshima. And as I say, I would recommend both of these books to you very greatly, and much of what I'm going to say in some of my talk now is informed by some of the ideas set out in these books. And I just want to take you through a few of the ideas that are set out in these volumes, perhaps particularly in Roberta Gilchrist's book. She asks a series of questions that she wants to answer. She wants to know how sacred heritage is used to construct narratives relating to nationalist and religious identities. We all live in nation states, and so why should the archaeology of one nation be of interest to people living in another nation? We know that it is. We can see that through international tourism. People love to travel the world and go and visit World Heritage sites, in particular sites of sacred heritage, even if they're not followers of those religious ideas, even if they're not members of those nation states themselves. She also asks, what is the role of archaeology in authenticating or challenging sacred myths and religious narratives? And she sees that archaeology provides a way of authenticating the spiritual authority of sacred sites. Now, we know that Okinoshima has tremendous spiritual authority. There are networks across Japan of people who follow what happens at Okinoshima very closely, and I know it plays a large part in their world. And I'm very interested in how archaeology might contribute to that. The third question that Professor Gilchrist asks is, can sacred landscapes or seascapes, because I think this is a topic that interests me very much. I see Okinoshima and the Munakata region as being a sacred seascape. How can these be understood as contested sites, which hold multiple meanings for different contemporary social groups? Now, Gilchrist answers these questions through some detailed case studies of sites in the UK, which I'm going to come back to a little bit later on, one or two of the examples. But she makes some important points. One is that authenticity is probably culturally relative. What does that mean? It means that authenticity probably varies depending on social and cultural contexts. She's also very keen to understand how what she terms the spiritual credentials of a place. How are those spiritual credentials established? How is the spiritual authenticity of a place established? She's interested also in this notion of authentic archaeology. As you all know, today we live in a world full of fake news, fake history, fake all sorts of things. There's definitely fake archaeology out there. But when archaeologists are involved, people tend to assume that what they're being told is correct. So archaeological evidence is authenticated by experts, and that's a very important part of this process. But she then says that authenticity is a deliberate strategy for negotiating the grey areas between fact and belief, and maintains a neutral or objective middle ground between established religions and alternative spiritualities. And I think some of this very interesting, I think, contemporary thinking on the archaeology of religion and the significance of sacred heritage sites, which is of great relevance when we think about Okinoshima. When I did my first papers about Okinoshima, I said one of the things that I found really wonderful about Okinoshima, I was so lucky, I was so fortunate to be able to visit Okinoshima as part of my engagement with the World Heritage process. And it really made me think about experiencing sacred sites. What does it really mean to experience these places? Many of us may perhaps do not have strongly held religious views, but we try and respect those who do, and we still enjoy visiting sacred and religious sites, and we get something out of that. Perhaps it's just a sense of awe, or a sense of the numinous, which perhaps, or a sense of the otherworldly, removing ourselves from everyday concerns in our lives. Gilchrist makes some interesting points, and she comes up with this idea of thin places, which she takes from other specialists working on religion. And thin places are regarded as places where the gap between our world, the everyday world, the physical world, and what in Japanese would be Anoyo, or the other world, or the spiritual world, places where that gap is very thin. And she feels that these thin places have a particular connection with notions of deep time. And very often the historicity of these places is as important as the place itself. It's that sense of being somewhere that has always been there or been there for a very, very long time. Now, as I said, one of the challenges we have at Okinoshima is that nobody can visit apart from those Shinto priests who look after the shrines. It is a hidden, taboo, secret place. So what can we do about that? There's the wonderful museum just up the road, the Museum of the Sea, the Umi no Michi Munakata. And if you go and visit that, you get a nice idea about what Okinoshima looks like, because there's a huge screen where pictures are presented, a movie is presented, and there are models of Okinoshima, and that's as close as you can get to experiencing what Okinoshima is like. Now, I do quite a lot of work with digital reconstructions of archaeological sites, because I feel that maybe this is one way to get people to visit places that they can't actually get to for one reason or another. But there is a critique of digital reconstructions and models that I want to flag up with you. And again, this is Gilchrist picking up from some of what another specialist, Cornelius Holtorf, who is the UNESCO Chair of Heritage Studies at the University of Kalmar in Sweden, has said. And I've put some of their ideas together a little bit here. But the problem with digital reconstructions is that they lack a sense of materiality. They lack that opportunity to experience time depth and spatial context. And if you're looking at a model, or if you're looking on a computer screen, it's very difficult to put across the sense of awe, that sense of patina, or the sense of pastness and proximity that we get by actually visiting real places. And I know how true that is. I love visiting temples and shrines in Japan. And you go there and you have a visit there and you come away and you really feel that you've engaged with a place where maybe ritual, sacred practices have been going on for a long time. And experiencing that is really very special. And it said that it's the tactile, material traces of what Cornelius Holtorf identifies as age value that can prompt emotional responses in the viewer. And archaeology has the power to provoke those emotional and spiritual experiences in the visitor. Now, we're just editing a new book on archaeological heritage management in Japan. And my esteemed colleague, Okadera Miki, has written a wonderful paper about Okinoshima. And in that paper, she reveals that when Okinoshima was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2017, the visitor numbers to Munakata increased 9 times, a 9-fold increase, from about 10,000 people a year to 90,000 people a year. Now, all these people could go to Munakata, but they couldn't go to Okinoshima itself. And I'm very interested in that experience of going to a place, but not being able to access the reason for going to visit there in the first place. I was also very lucky to be invited by Professor Harunari Hideji to contribute a short paper to this publication, a special issue of the journal Kikan Kokugaku, Archaeology Quarterly, entitled Sekai no Naka no Okinoshima, Okinoshima in the world. And I was asked to write a little piece about looking at Okinoshima from a British perspective. And I found myself thinking about issues of state formation and archaeology, and the relationships between religion, economy, trade networks, and architecture, so religious buildings themselves. And I also found myself thinking a lot about the relationship between myth and history. And there were 3 case studies that I looked at: Tintagel, Glastonbury, and Sutton Hoo and Rendlesham, which I will come back to a little later in my talk. So let's take ourselves to Okinoshima. It's a taboo place. So, and one of the taboos is that you're not allowed to tell anybody about what you saw. But I checked with my colleagues there, and they said, well, you can show them pictures, you just can't tell them, and you're not allowed to take anything away. So what I'm going to do is just show you a few pictures of Okinoshima to set the scene. And you'll see wonderful pictures in the Umi no Michi Munakata-kan, as I said, or if you go to the Shimpo-kan at Munakata Taisha, you can also get a lovely sense of what Okinoshima is really like. As I say, I can't tell you what I saw, but it is an amazing place. And I'm so pleased that it is now safely inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage. And of course, at the heart of the Okinoshima Island is this amazing complex of huge rocks. And it's around the rocks that we have evidence for a whole series of rituals. And I'm very grateful to my colleagues in the World Heritage Promotion Committee for allowing me to show these slides that they put together. And what we're able to do as a result of the careful archaeological work that was undertaken there in the 1950s and the 1970s is to recreate the sequence whereby rituals changed on Okinoshima. So what have we got? 23 known ritual sites were investigated, dating to the 4th and the 9th centuries AD. We know that over 80,000 objects were deposited, many of which have been designated as national treasures in Japan. And we know that these were excavated in 3 campaigns between 1954 and 1971. We know that this is a secret place, as I said. Before I went, I was told very sternly, remove nothing from the island, not even a blade of grass. Tell nobody what you saw. No women. We'll come back to that. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail because I know there are other specialists who are speaking to you who will give you a much, much broader, much more in-depth analysis of the different phases of activity at Okinoshima. But for me, one of the things that's really interesting about this site is the fact that we've got a religious tradition, a tradition of sacred practice, which changes over time. And we've got a continuity of practice. And then we have, later on, we've got these practices being reinstated so that Okinoshima today and the Munakata Grand Shrine is still a major center of ritual activity. There's some geopolitical context to the inscription of Okinoshima, which we ought to think about if we're trying to understand Okinoshima from a world perspective. It was inscribed at a time of increased interest in maritime and island heritage. This notion of seascapes, as I've talked about, is popular and relates to understandings of cultural landscapes. And now indeed, within UNESCO, whole cultural landscapes can be inscribed as World Heritage. Okinoshima is described as the shosoin of the sea, Umi no shosoin, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. And the Silk Roads are very much in world attention today, partly because of the Chinese government's Belt Road Initiative, or BRI, which is linking China with Africa and with Europe, new trans-Eurasian trade routes in an increasingly connected world. In itself, controversial, but a major initiative, and we have to understand Okinoshima in that context. We're also at a time when Shinto itself, the indigenous religion of Japan, is reinventing itself, if you like. Scholars like Mark Tuen and John Breen and Helen Hardacre have brought this story to a non-Japanese audience, and I would encourage you to read their books and get a sense of the richness of the debate around Shinto. And something that has always interested me is the relationship between this troubled question of the origins of Shinto and the adoption of Buddhism, the arrival of Buddhism in the Japanese archipelago from the 6th century onwards. And all of these things that come together, if you like, in the study of Okinoshima. So, the shosoin of the sea. What do we mean by that? As you know, the shosoin is the imperial treasury from Nara period Japan, which was constructed in the 8th century and contained treasures from all along the Silk Road. Glass from Persia, silks from China, ceramics from China, gold from Korea, all sorts of wonderful things. And I believe right now the shosoin special exhibition will be happening at the Nara National Museum. Courtesy of the terrible pandemic that's happening at the moment, I can't get to see it this year, which is a big shame. But I very much hope to be able to get back in future years and see later versions of that exhibition. Now, among the objects that were found at Okinoshima were many exotic objects from far-flung places, including gold from Korea, glass fragments from Persia, these gilt bronze dragon finials, probably from China, ceramics from China, bronze mirrors from China, and this rather wonderful little object, which is a miniature silk weaving loom, thought to be from Okinoshima, found a long time ago before the archaeological excavations took place. All now on display in the Munakata Grand Shrine Shimpokan, that wonderful museum that is right there next to the shrine. Now we know that the Silk Road has been of great interest in Japan for many, many years. One of my first visits to Japan in 1988 coincided with the great Silk Road exhibition in front of the Todaiji Temple in Nara. And I was able to visit that exhibition, and ever since then I've been fascinated by the secrets and treasures of the shosoin. It is a collection of materials dating to early medieval China, Korea and Japan, which just don't survive as in such good condition anywhere else. And for my money, it is well worth regarding the shosoin as the eastern terminus of the Silk Roads. Here's just a little array of these wonderful materials. Musical instruments, mirrors, I say, beautiful inlaid silver vessels, silks, there are books, there are medicinal materials. The list is endless. And NHK made a wonderful television series about 40 years ago, visiting many of the sites from which these objects came. Here is a map showing the extent of the Silk Roads, and one of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is revisiting this, and I'll come back to that again a little towards the end of my talk. Now, we know that the earliest written accounts that we have about life in the Japanese archipelago were not written in Japan, they were written by Chinese people. And these Chinese accounts talk about a land called Fusang. And here's just a little description of how perhaps Japan was seen from China and Korea at the time when the religious deposits were being made on Okinoshima, this period when many envoys were being sent from Japan to Korea and China, and Japan was welcoming envoys from the continent as well. And what I want to pull out here is that Japan was seen very much as a place where mulberry trees grew. What do we say? Mulberry trees of more than 1,000 meters rising from the blue seas. And there's a whole terminology of the intertwining mulberry tree, or the fusang, as a metaphor for ancient Japan. And of course, it's mulberry that produces silk. And we know that the Munakata deities were silk weaving deities. And that is something, a theme that I think is worth exploring a little bit further as we look at the various narratives that we can weave together around Okinoshima and the sacred sites. So it's a tremendous resource. Okinoshima and the associated sites of the Munakata region. So I was slightly disappointed at the coverage in the Western media of the inscription of Okinoshima as a World Heritage Site. This is the Daily Telegraph, one of the most conservative, renowned newspapers in the United Kingdom, particularly famous for its foreign coverage. They grabbed the story about it being a men-only island. It wasn't only The Guardian. In the BBC, Okinoshima, the sacred Japanese island that women are banned from visiting. This was the headline. And I spoke extensively to my colleagues in the World Heritage Promotion Committee. I said, how are we going to find ways to get people to think, look behind these headlines and to think about other ways to appreciate what these sites are all about? Of course, we know that women can go to the Yohaijo and they can view Okinoshima. I don't know if we can see it on this photograph. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Just floating out on the horizon, just out there. I've seen it a few times on clear days. But very, very few people can actually get to see what the religious facilities look like on Okinoshima itself, although they are able to visit the Munakata Grand Shrine and the shrine on the island of Oshima as well. Perhaps for many people visiting the Munakata Grand Shrine, they're there having their car blessed, or they're there for other more normal Shinto practices. Many people also visit in October for the Miare festival, when all the fishermen of the Munakata region from the port of the gods, they make this wonderful boat procession around the island as the goddesses are taken from one home to another. So I think that there's a number of research themes that come out of the study of Okinoshima. And one of them is, how can all of these non-visitors, these people who can't go there, how can they appreciate the value of what is there? And I think we can help them understand that by weaving all these different narratives together. Understanding the place that Okinoshima has in East Asian history, looking at religion, politics, and the interaction embodied by all of the envoys who we know were going backwards and forwards to East Asia at this time. I think we can also really draw on this idea of the archaeology of religious experience, which is both comparative and universal. I think we can help people understand one of the big changes which happens at Okinoshima in that ritual tradition. And that's the change from the worship of natural places to worshipping at monuments or in buildings. And I think that shift that we see on the island from the ritual deposits around the boulders to the construction of shrine facilities in amongst those boulders is fundamental, very, very important. And understanding that, I think, is key to what we're seeing going on here. But we also need to think about notions of isolation and taboo. What extra power does that give Okinoshima, the fact that nobody can go? Makes us more curious. We will want to go, but we can't. And I think this leads me on to an area that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, which is the outstanding universal value of secret places and hidden treasures. There are not many World Heritage Sites, especially the cultural ones, maybe some of the natural ones, not many of the cultural ones which you really can't get to. Now, I'm going to come on now in the second part of or the later part of my talk, just to give you a few comparators from my part of the world. We know that the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, written in the early 8th century, are where we find the first accounts of the Munakata deities and the Munakata clans. And I'm sure we have other specialists who are going to tell us much more about that. In my country, in England, what is now the United Kingdom, it wasn't the United Kingdom then, from the 5th through to the 10th century, we're in what is called the Anglo-Saxon period, or the early medieval period, when many different peoples came into the country from Germany and the Low Countries of Denmark and from around the North Sea. And they established their own kingdoms in England. And we know the history of this period from a number of written sources. For example, there is Gildas and on the ruin of Britain from the 6th century, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle from the 9th century. But just like the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, these are not straightforward history, but this is a blend of history, myth, and legend and observation. And for me, this is what makes it really gripping reading, wanting to know what these early medieval historians were all about. The chronicles, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, were written in different places around the country. You can see by the yellow dots, and they still survive. They're wonderful documents, and we've got one close to where I live in Cambridge. Now, in addition to this, we've got religious authors, people like Bede, the Venerable Bede, who wrote one of the earliest histories of religion in England, and also wrote about the attacks by the Vikings. He lived in the northeast of England, in Lindisfarne, in a part of the country that was open territory for Viking attacks. Here he is in the 8th century, so he's alive at the time that the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are being written down. In my dreams, I imagine what the conversation between Bede and Ono Yasumaru might have been like as the early chroniclers of the history of England and Japan. Bede, the Venerable Bede, is buried in Durham Cathedral today, but his history, the Historia Britonum, the ecclesiastical history of the English nation, is our main source for understanding the ways in which our established world religion, Christianity, comes into England and interacts with indigenous religious beliefs. Another one is Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the English Kings. And we have Geoffrey of Monmouth to thank for, again, some really interesting historical detail, but plenty of fanciful myth and legend. In particular, Geoffrey of Monmouth talks a lot about a king called Arthur, King Arthur, who is perhaps the most famous legendary king in England. We don't even know if he really existed. In Japan, you've got Himiko. In England, we've got Arthur. And here he is, and he was rediscovered and reinvented in the 19th century by famous poets like Malory in his wonderful long poem, Le Mort d'Arthur, the Death of Arthur. King Arthur has been represented in art, in film, in stories, in literature, all through the ages. And I said is one of our founding figures of British mythology. And he's definitely British because he is set up in distinction to the Anglo-Saxons who arrived in the United Kingdom from the 6th and 7th centuries. King Arthur is set up as a Celtic British king. And that is a distinction that I think is interesting if we compare what's happening in Japan with the different groups promoting Buddhism or Shinto and competing with each other. Now, Arthur lived in a place called Camelot, and I was delighted to discover that there's a Japanese anime and computer games all about Camelot, which will give you a good idea of what it probably wasn't very much like. This is the site in England, in Cornwall, right in the west of England, which is considered to be the site of Arthur's castle at Camelot, a site called Tintagel. It is an amazing, dramatic location above black cliffs on the North Cornish coast. And you have to, until just a few years ago, you had to walk up very steep steps to get up to the castle, which is just up here. Recently and controversially, a new bridge has been constructed so everybody can access the site. But for a long time, Tintagel was a place that not many people could actually get to because it was so inaccessible, being right at the top of this steep cliff. Just a couple of views of Tintagel for you. There were excavations at Tintagel in the through the 20th century, which recovered many of these dark age features. These are the features from what would be the Anglo-Saxon period, the early medieval period. And we've got a whole series of buildings here, these yellow features, predating a later castle from the 12th, 13th centuries. But it's the finds from these dark age features that have been really interesting and have been reanalyzed in recent years. And there's been recent excavations here which demonstrate that Tintagel was very well connected with the rest of the European continent. There are wine amphorae from the Mediterranean. There's glass from Europe. And there's possibly food that's being imported from Europe as well. So this quintessentially British site was in fact amazingly well connected with what was happening in Europe at the same time. So a comparison between this site and what is happening in the Munakata region, one of the areas that's most connected to the East Asian continent at a similar time, I feel would be very interesting. Here's a fanciful reconstruction of what Tintagel may have looked like when it was Camelot. And it's the location of the famous round table around which King Arthur sat his Knights of the Round Table. My second site, and this is a site that Professor Roberta Gilchrist, who I was talking about earlier on in my talk, has been much involved in. This is Glastonbury in the west of England. And this is considered to be this place, Avalon. This is where King Arthur is considered to have died, if he died. Many people don't believe he did die, in fact. And this site is now the focus of much attention by many different religious and social groups. Also, Glastonbury is perhaps most famous today in the world for the huge Glastonbury Pop Festival, which takes place each summer. Just a couple of pictures of what Glastonbury looks like for you. It is a medieval abbey from the 12th century. And it was in fact in the 12th century, in 1191, that the monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed they had discovered King Arthur's grave and the grave of his wife, Queen Guinevere. There's been recent reinvestigation of Glastonbury and of all of the archaeology that's been going on there. And Roberta Gilchrist, that professor that I've been talking about a lot in this talk, was at the center of that reinvestigation. They used digital reconstructions to give a sense of how the site looked earlier on in its life. Digital reconstructions which involved many different members of the community, what they call co-creation of these resources. So working with the local community to create models of what they thought Glastonbury may have looked like. What I want to focus on is the fact that Glastonbury, as well as being this place that's associated with King Arthur, and also a very important Christian monastery in its own right, is a center for alternative spiritualities. And here is a list of some of those alternatives. In England, we have New Age people. This is the community of Avalon, the people who believe this is where King Arthur died and where his wonderful sword, his magical sword Excalibur, was taken from the stone. It is the center of a druidic university. It's associated with Joseph of Arimathea, the man who is considered to have buried Jesus in the Holy Land. It's also the focus of a prehistoric goddess cult. And here are some of our English goddesses. And I wonder what they would make of our Munakata deities at Okinoshima. It'd be wonderful to bring them together at some point. All of these different interests. And it all means that Glastonbury is a thin place. We talked about thin places earlier, where the gap between this world and the other world is thin, where the physical and the spiritual realms meet, linking the present place to the deep past. Now, I just want to really finish off looking at some of the exotic things which are involved in these connections, the trade routes and how religion may inform them. Now, a couple of years ago, 2016, this hit the headlines: Roman coins found in Okinawa. And for many people, it was unimaginable that these objects, they were in medieval deposits. So it had taken a long, long time, maybe 1,000 years, for these coins to make their way from the Roman Mediterranean to what is now Japan. But they did. And they are they're not very impressive to look at, maybe, but they are extraordinarily interesting in the stories that they tell of the connectivity of the ancient world. At the other end of Eurasia, we have this extraordinary object, which has fired my enthusiasm and piqued my interest over the last couple of years. This is a small bronze Buddha statue, probably made in the Swat Valley in northern Pakistan in the 6th century AD. But it wasn't found in Pakistan. It was found here in this little tiny place called Helior in Sweden. Helior means holy island. And it was found in the house of a Viking from the 7th century AD. Somehow this object had made its way along the Silk routes to Sweden. It was associated with some other religious regalia, including a beautiful silver and gilt bronze bishop's crozier. This is one of the symbolic tools of a Christian bishop that was probably brought back during a Viking raid in the middle years of that first millennium. Here's the site, to sort of give you a little bit of a view of what it looked like. Helior, it's another island, and there have been excavations there which show where the houses are. We know that the Vikings really got about in ships, and this is the Viking ship museum in Oslo. And any of you who have the opportunity, do go. These are amazing objects. So these are ships from the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, and they are incredibly well preserved. One of my dreams is to bring a Viking ship to Munakata one day. We know that the Vikings used these boats not only for water transport to get all across much of Western Eurasia, and we find traces of the Vikings as far in the east as what is now the Caucasus. We know that they were in Constantinople because they left their graffiti on the walls of Hagia Sophia. And of course, we know to the west, the Vikings got as far as Greenland and America. And the trading routes of the Vikings are exemplified by sites like Birka in Sweden. And we know these were tremendous trading entrepôts that they were bringing back all of these great treasures that they were finding on their journeys around the world. And one of the most extraordinary things for me, which I was able to see a couple of years ago in the University Museum of the University of Uppsala, are these silk fragments from Viking graves, which to me really just sum up how important understanding those connections along these ancient silk routes were. This is a site closer to home, a little earlier than the Vikings themselves, but perhaps the most famous site of Anglo-Saxon England, called Sutton Hoo. It's a burial ground. And I know that we have burial grounds as part of the associated sites of the Munakata region. And it was burial grounds were one of the things I was looking at for my comparative analysis. We have the most iconic Anglo-Saxon material culture from Sutton Hoo. It was a ship burial. This ship, the king was buried in a ship above which was constructed an earthen mound. And he was buried with all of his treasure, with his armor. And here is the Sutton Hoo helmet. And you can see that there is a cross on the helmet, which some people suggest indicates the influence of Christianity on what was otherwise a pagan Saxon king. And here is a reconstruction of that Sutton Hoo ship burial. Now, I mentioned Bede and his history of Christianity in England. Bede talks about a place very close to Sutton Hoo called Rendlesham. And he talks about a king, King Redwald, who is converted to Christianity at Rendlesham. And what we have here is the site of that conversion. And there's a really exciting project happening right now investigating the archaeology of that area. Just a little further to the south, we have another burial mound, also dating to the 6th century AD, at a place called Prittlewell. Here are the remains of the mound, and from this mound we have some amazing exotic material culture, including these exquisite blue glass bowls, which I think would have had a very similar impact to the cut glass bowl, fragments of which were found on the island of Okinoshima. We have this rather lovely bronze drinking vessel from Syria, from the Mediterranean, which may have been brought back by pilgrims. But most extraordinarily, we have these two gold foil crosses, which were found placed on the eyelids of the young man who was buried in this burial mound in this way. Here's a reconstruction of the burial. And again, what we seem to have are early traces of Christianity in what would otherwise be non-Christian Saxon contexts. And it's that combination of the two that I find very interesting when one's thinking about what's happening at Okinoshima and Munakata, when we tend to think about that being the origins of Shinto's story, but at the same time as those deposits are being made, of course, Buddhism is being introduced into Japan at the same time. And that is a narrative that I would very much like to explore further in the future. So just to finish, I'd like to ask you a question. How global is our heritage? And how global is our idea of sacred heritage? I think that the World Heritage Movement is a fantastic development for us, and it gives us frameworks and ways of thinking through these questions, allowing us to understand the true global significance of sites like Okinoshima and the associated sites of the Munakata region. We're doing a little bit ourselves. This is my university museum at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts. And we have some beautiful early Buddhist and a little bit of early Shinto art as well. And over the next 4 years, we're going to be running a research project, hopefully with some exhibitions as well, which we're calling The Arrival of Belief at the Extremities of the Silk Roads. And we're going to be exploring the connections, even if it's just connections of ideas and comparable processes from Okinoshima, Asuka and Nara, all along these Silk Roads, the land Silk Roads and the maritime Silk Roads, over to England and Sutton Hoo, and up to Sweden to Helgö and Birka. I very much hope you'll be able to come and see some of the things that we're doing, and we'd like to be able to bring some of them to Japan as well and involve Okinoshima in this if we possibly can. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. Thank you again for the kind invitation for me to give this talk, and I hope I've just given you a little flavor of why I find the notion of sacred heritage and the archaeology of religion couldn't have a better place to study than the sacred island of Okinoshima and the associated sites of the Munakata region. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.